Nothing gives me greater pleasure than to see so many here who are concerned about the buildings, traditions of Yale and the city of New Haven. And to welcome John DiStefano, Mayor of New Haven, who has joined our audience for Professor Scully's talk. On behalf of the Yale School of Architecture, I welcome you to Yale and to Yale Constructs, the first comprehensive discussion of the university's immense current program of planning, renewal, and innovation, and its relationship to the history of the university and to the city in which the university is so important a part. Tomorrow and Sunday, planners and architects and administrators currently responsible for our university's incomparable man-made environment will present ideas and examples of their work for our consideration and discussion. Please note that all sessions will take place in this room, not in Lindsley Chittenden Hall, as it says in the program. What would a symposium be if it didn't have confusions? Tonight, Professor Vincent Scully, Sterling Emeritus Professor of the History of Art, will set the stage for that discussion, which will take place tomorrow. Set the stage with a history and appreciation of Yale's architectural legacy and the legacy of its relationship to the city of New Haven. I know Professor Scully will lift the veils from our eyes and the cobwebs from our understanding. He has done nothing less than that for over 50 years at this university. Vincent Scully is, as the cliche would have it, a man who needs no introduction. He is also a man who deserves a much better introduction than I could ever give him. I cannot rise to the level of his language or to the insight of his observations. I can only be personal and direct. Vincent Scully transformed my view of what architecture was and what it could be. And I dare say he's done nothing less for almost all of us in this room. I know that we will leave this hall tonight in some way changed and for the better, enriched and inspired, and empowered to revere this university as more than a collection of computers, books, budgets, schedules. Helped by Vincent Scully's words and the clarity of his vision, we will be renewed in our appreciation of why Yale is the great place of learning that it is, a place built by human beings to act in community with each other, a great enterprise built over time with respect for the past and confidence in the future, a great city within a great city. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the great historian, my teacher, my conscience, and the conscience of all Yale, Vincent Scully.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all. Bob says you'll leave changed. You'll probably leave bored to death. Also, I've seen so many friends here tonight that I haven't seen in 35 years, so I hardly know how to begin anyway. I have to begin with an apology, which is there's so much that I'm not going to talk about tonight, that I can't talk about. I'm not talking about the work of Herbie Newman or Howard Roth or Pelley, Gary, and Venturi at the medical school. Matter of fact, I'm not talking about the medical school at all. And as is typical of Yale, precious little about the sciences. Because what I'd like to do is to concentrate as much as the topic allows upon, I think, is the major problem that we're all concerned with in Yale and New Haven at the present time, and that is the relationship between the two of us, between our institutions. The architectural, urbanistic, and communal relationship of Yale to New Haven, and I'd like to talk, too, about how that's changed over the centuries. Today, I think most of us see it, especially perhaps New Haveners, see Yale as one large, unified, rich, intrusive body in a city which, like almost all cities of the Northeast, is in economic trouble. But that's probably not the way to formulate the problem. One tends to see, talking about it, to speak about the power of Yale and the need of New Haven. But again, I say, that's probably all wrong, and it's not the way it all started. Because Yale started, as you know, as simply one product of the transcendent vision that shaped colonial New Haven, with its 9 perfect squares and its great green. Behind that grid in history are the colonial grids of the Greeks and Sicily, and the great legionary squares of Rome in North Africa, and indeed all over the world. And ideal cities of the Renaissance, designed for utopia, and even, as was once suggested, English fortified towns in a subjected Ireland. But I agree with Archer, and now with Eric Vogt, that New Haven has a far nobler model than that. And that is to say, when John Winthrop was aboard ship, the Arbella, in 1630, still in the Atlantic, heading toward the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he gave that great sermon in which he said, "We shall be as a city upon a hill." There he was quoting Matthew. But John Davenport's New Haven of 1638 is a city under a hill, and its source is the Old Testament. Its source is Ezekiel, the prophet of the Babylonian captivity, the poet of disaster and exile. In chapter 40, Ezekiel says, "In the 25th year of our captivity, in the 14th year after the city was smitten," Jerusalem, "the hand of the Lord was upon me, and brought me, in the visions of God, brought he me into the land of Israel, and set me on a very high mountain, which was as the frame of a city on the south." And that here is the mountain, there's the city on the south. And Ezekiel goes on, and he says, "He brought me thither, and behold, there was a man with a line of flax in his hand, and a measuring reed, and he stood in the gate." And then he describes how the 9 squares are laid out, and the 3 precincts on each side, and how right in the center there's the temple. And the temple has 4 gates. The last gate he describes is the gate on the east. And he says, "Below, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east." Came from the way of the east. "And the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate, whose prospect is toward the east." And I think that's why Wadsworth, in 1748, that Yale senior, when he drew the first plan we have of New Haven, did it unusually with east below and west above. So he could show in the center the wonderful elevational perspective they have that brings the map to life. He could show the gate of the meeting house, which faces toward the east. And all plans in New Haven, almost all, since that time, have had that special orientation. And they have made us see New Haven and Yale in relation to New Haven in a certain way. Then, beyond that, is the fact that this town of New Haven outbid all the other towns in Connecticut to bring the university, a new college, to it. And that was Yale University. And they put up the money and gave the land in the best site in town on the height above the green, because the green does slope well up. And there you look across New Haven. And in 1717 and 18 run-up overnight was the first Yale building, which was the Yale College House there, which is named for Elihu Yale. And this was the biggest building in town. The meeting house was only 60 feet square or so. This was 150 feet long. We know it only from drawings like this one and elevation drawings like that one and one can't at all, I think, vouch for the plan. But it was enormous. It was a simple Puritan house type, stretched to an enormous degree, and the biggest building in town. And then in 1775, in Styles' plan, you can see the town has grown up. Watch the focus, please. It'll go out of focus. Right? The town has grown up. It's more densely populated. The meeting house has given way to 2 churches, meeting houses turning into churches with spires at their ends. And also there is the Colony House, which Yale shared as the head of the colony with Hartford. And then if we look up where the Yale College House was pressed right up there to College Street, tight up to the corner, we can see just vaguely that there are 2 other buildings. Another building which is apparently behind it, and a building with a spire, which is there as well. And if we look at it, here we can see that there's the green, and there's the Colony House, and there is the Yale College House pressed up to the corner, and then set well back, there's a spire of the chapel, which President Clapp had built because by that time he felt that the congregation on the church on the green was no longer to his liking. First, it was too advanced for him. Later, it was too conservative for him. But he wanted Yale students to go to their own chapel. He also wanted to withdraw them a little bit from the street. So he brought them back instead of pushed up to the street. And in front of it, they had their yard. And then the Yale fence was down along the edge of the street. And the openings are still on both sides toward the street and on the other side. And the chapel faces toward the town. And the buildings are open to the town, but there's this symbolic yard in front with the Yale fence where town and gown meet. And there's President Styles, and the students are taking off their hat to him as he walks through the campus. Then, Styles, however, had the model of Harvard in mind, and he wanted to bring at least one, and probably in the end, 2 buildings, as at Harvard, perpendicularly out toward the street here from Connecticut Hall, right there, to give this organization. But instead, and we know that the townspeople didn't like it. We don't know quite why, but we do know that the great James Hillhouse, who was really New Haven's great hero, a war hero, a congressman, a senator, and the treasurer of Yale, he got hold of Colonel John Trumbull, who was already a friend of Washington and of Jefferson, and was to be the great painter of the Revolution, and he got Trumbull to make an alternate plan as against Styles's view. And this plan was immediately adopted by the corporation. You see, there's Connecticut Hall in the middle. There's the chapel to its left, and Trumbull proposes another building here, and then a second building, the Athenaeum, like a chapel, to the right of it, and then another house-type building here to the north. And in front he has the yard, and he plants trees. And that's Hillhouse. As we know, James Hillhouse was the great planter of the elms. And those trees were set here to frame these buildings. And then the Yale fence here was out at the line of the street. Behind it, as in Jefferson's Monticello, there was a little romantic garden. There's a hole out of that corner of the lot right there, which Yale didn't own until much later. And curiously enough, there was a fire station there for a long time. And Yale students and firemen used to fight. And curiously enough, it was Yale students who would kill the firemen twice, knife them both times. Yale students in the 19th century, if one worries about Yale students in New Haven, here New Haven had to worry about Yale students if they got too close to it. And the privies and so on were back there as well. And the other thing that Trumbull did, you see it here, it's probably, Vogt may be right when he suggests that Trumbull here, proposing this in 1791-92, had seen Jefferson's proposal of 1791, his wonderful little plan before L'Enfant for the Capitol in Washington, which is a little like this in the sense that it has walks in front and is stretched out longitudinally with a beautiful view down the Potomac toward Alexandria. But then Jefferson did intend to contain it like this, and Trumbull here had no such idea. Trumbull also did a beautiful second page. There are just these two sheets, and on it he creates the ideal plan type, which the very best Yale dormitories since that time have always had. Connecticut Hall had these studies right here, cutting into the living room, very awkward way. He worked it going right through, windows on both sides, right through the bar of the building, with the living room here and two bedrooms and fireplaces there. And that's basically the model that lodges use later for the colleges. And then for the Athenaeum, because it's not a church, he wasn't going to have a spire. But fortunately, and I'm not sure who made this decision, when it was built, it broke a little out of type, and it used the spire. But what you have are the two great colonial types. You have the house, and you have the church, and you have them just extended as simply as possible as this wonderful wall. The Yale brick row open to the town, pulled back from it, students playing ball on the green. New Haven passed laws against that time after time. But nevertheless, the sense is that it's open to the town, but in its own wonderful kind of way, like the first college house, it tends to dominate it. And the best view of it, I think, is this one. Here are the trees, great elms were planted in front of it. Here's the Yale fence on Chapel Street, and here going up College. There's where town and gown meet. But there's this wonderful ample, the idea of a campus which is also open to the town. And we're told the townsfolk walk through there, always moving through it. It was, in fact, open to the town there in use. Then the next move, you can see best, I think, if we look at the plan, it was also James Hillhouse who saw to the subdivision of New Haven. So you had a better scale of the 9 squares. And he also planted, as well as here, he also planted here along Temple Street. This road was never there, but the Trumbull's vision only extended to this point, but it was so clear and obvious that it continued to be built, and it extended now finally to a second chapel over here, and this last building here, and the president's house by this time was there, and later the first divinity school was put right there. Then by this map, this Doolittle map of 1824, you have the 3 churches, and there on that new street, which is appropriately called Temple Street, and they're built in the Greek Revival period, and they're facing east like Greek temples, but also like Ezekiel's vision of the meeting house. And there's the State House now, New Haven still sharing with Hartford, the capital of the state, and the roads are, it's all subdivided. But the other thing is that if you take that wonderful planting, that real architecture of the town is becoming more the elms than anything else. And when you think that Yale University, in its architecture school, has no permanent division of landscape architecture, one can cry, because the tree, in New Haven especially, was the basic glory of the town. And we owe that to James Hillhouse. Now, to him also, of course, we owe Hillhouse Avenue. And Hillhouse Avenue, of course, is an extension of the 9 squares. And it's the development, and Doolittle's map of 1824 goes off the east-west. I'm sure so he could show exactly that. He could begin to show those extensions. Now, Hillhouse, right there, immediately sets up a problem, because in a typically romantic way, in the new romantic way, he wants to focus on Sachem Hill, which is his hill, where his house is. And it's called Sachem Hill because he looked like a sachem. He looked like an Indian chief. And that great type here that he developed that goes through 19th century suburbs and in a way climaxes in Coral Gables in Florida, in Merrick's great plan of the early 1920s with the wonderful grass plots. And look how narrow the street is. and how generous the grass plots, and the elms arching, and the great houses on both sides, climaxing eventually in the Hill House mansion at the end. But it goes off at an angle here. And then the one street, the new street here, is the single one that goes directly to the Great Mountain, to East Rock. And I'm sorry I don't have that in color, because as a sacred mountain, as you know, it's amazing to see something like this in Connecticut. When the sunset hits it, it burns red like a butte in Arizona, full of power. And we're so used to it that we don't think about it twice. But the power is there. And this is the one street that runs directly to its heart. And then State Street angles off to avoid it. And Whitney angles to come into it at this point where the river is, where the water power can be used for the first of New Haven's great factories, which were to make New Haven in the 19th and early 20th century. And that, of course, is Eli Whitney there at Whitneyville, with really the first mass production and interchangeability of parts, the beginning of New Haven's great industrial past, now sadly, in many ways, so far diminished. Now, at the same time, when you have those streets going out like that, you also have Rose Street Cemetery, which is the creation of this suburban moment. And because of the angle which Prospects picks up from Hill House, it has an awkward shape. And indeed, you can see it's going to make problems later as it really intervenes between the 9 squares and then the other axis that Yale is going to follow, a diagonal axis up the hill. But it reflects, I think, New Haven's industrial development, because watch the focus, please, because the soft, rounded shapes of watch the focus of the closed bud papyrus capitals are here given invisibly now, I'm afraid, a sharp-edged thing like the ratchets on a mechanical metal gear. And you can really feel that there is, in this great gate by Henry Austin, a kind of sense of the mechanics, which are now, along with the Egyptian imagery, are working. Now, back in town itself, in this period, in the 1830s and 40s, and right into the 50s, it's a great pastoral scene. And it's a scene which is still dominated by the Protestant establishment. There here is a new state house by Ithiel Town of 1828. And it replaces the old one that was in an awkward relationship here. It's placed back about here. It was, as you can see, a very beautiful building, a little Greek temple set there in the trees. Therefore, of course, they tore it down. Actually, they tore it down in 1888, when Hartford became the sole capital and New Haven lost it. Again, it's too bad that happened. But nevertheless, the image in 1838 at the bicentennial of New Haven, in this beautiful little medal by Ithiel Town, shows that beautiful world where the desert here shall rejoice in Isaiah and blossom as the rose. And there are all the spires, and there's the State House behind, and all the trees, and there's the image of New Haven. There's that sacred image of New Haven. Now, by that time, of course, by the 1850s, New Haven had become industrialized. The railroads had come in the 1840s. The Irish came, my ancestors, manning the factories down below, filling up off here and over toward Fairhaven and toward East Haven. But that whole new quality of a city which was no longer one great Protestant image, which had a lot of Catholics in it and a lot of non-English in it, more and more later, great Italian population, Polish, Jewish, and so on, had nothing to express itself on this side of the green except the jail here, where I suppose they were incarcerated on Saturday nights when they became to its surface. Then, however, as you know, in 1859, the City Hall was built. And you can see we might have protested at that time. It breaks the scale, the old colonial Protestant scale. And they consciously say, we use Gothic architecture, which is not very well known in this country, but which is abroad. They want something special. So it's a big Gothic spire like an English town hall, and the mayor's office is just right here at the perfect spot, just a little high enough to look across the green. And then they realize it's a little narrow. So in 1869, they add on to it here, they say, with that beloved annex now unhappily gone, to give it a greater presence there on the green. And Yale's response to that instantly is to fortify itself against it. And to do it with the same kind of architecture. Now, as I said before, Yale and New Haven had been fighting at the fence for 2 centuries, often with sailors from the ships, sometimes from the firemen. But at the time of the Civil War, the riots were getting worse and worse. But somehow it was almost a statement by New Haven, and Yale closed off. And they pushed, as you know, Farnham Hall right up and got rid of the Yale fence, put it right where the Yale fence was. And indeed, it is like something from Europe. It's like by Russell Sturgis. It's right out of Viollet-le-Duc. It's really the fortified village of Carcassonne there. And it's a fortification and a wall that is presented to the town. And as you know, it's pushed forward, and the old brick row was still there for a while. Yale fence eventually was brought inside here. These buildings could only be entered from here, unlike the old entrance from the city, but then these buildings were progressively torn down. And why was it so easy to tear them down? Well, I think it has to do with this idea, which has been endemic in modern architecture, the 19th and 20th centuries, that style is what counts. You've got to have a special symbolic style. And every architect should be able to express himself in each individual building as if it were different from all others. But in some special and high style, it's exactly the same date, mid-60s, as Farnham, when you have Street Hall, which is, to our pride, the first organization to teach art, and this professional school in an institution of higher learning in the United States. This is off on Chapel Street. They seem less worried about relation to the town. It's that symbolic facade on the green that bothers them, and it stands by itself, a three-dimensional Ruskinian. They're both very Ruskinian as well, building there on the green. That meant, and they say it, that by that time, they regarded the buildings of the old brick row as little better than factories. And indeed, they did look like those factories that were down there in New Haven, and like the factories in Lowell, and like the factories that the great Aldo Rossi of sainted memory, the late Aldo Rossi, loved so much, because he's the type. And here's the difference. The difference between the type out of which you can make a town, because like an Italian palazzo, it's repetitive, and the high style that now, with a Ruskinian intensity, architects and patrons wanted. And because this was a simple type and simply repetitive, it was no longer good enough for Yale. And it was the second president, Dwight, who was the most unforgiving, who tore them all down. And to his death, he said, if I only could have gotten my hands on Connecticut Hall, because the alumni and some of the faculty stopped him. So Connecticut Hall remained there, and he had this ideal vision now with the Yale fence heavily denatured by the fact that it's no longer the meeting place between worlds, brought inside, and a new image, which I suppose is that of the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and of a kind of English monastic vision is there. But the big closure, of course, the rectangle, the quadrangle, is a wonderful form to express solidarity and community on the part of those who live in it. And the most striking ones I can think of are actually in the 20th century, not so much later than these. Like, for example, the great social democratic socialist housing in Vienna after World War I. This is the Karl Marx Hof. And when I visited, I felt that it was like The old campus, great, big, wonderful green. And then when you have a community, when you have a solidarity, you like to have a symbol that tells other people who you are and how they are not you. So on the outside of that Karl Marx Hof, the entrance, you have these great threatening shapes which say Karl Marx Hof. And they say, we're socialists. And the Yale, over the Yale gate, perhaps more ambiguous thing that doesn't really say what exactly we are, except maybe English or something like that. But whatever we are, we're important. This is the place. We man the gate. And indeed, finally, last of all, the last of the Yale fence over the opposition of alumni all over the world, international scandal, was consumed by Osborne. And it was wonderful. It was the most high style of them all by Bruce Price. You really feel it's like a Charybdis. It chewed up the gate, the fence, and spewed it out. It does open to the town more than Bingham, which succeeded it after 1927, does. That's closed completely. But nevertheless, everything about it is this difference, this high style, this threat, this power, these gnashing fangs as it comes out. It's really a wonderful building. And Price, who was a very expressionistic architect, I think sensed exactly what was wanted there, but everybody always hated it. They felt it was too much, it went too far. But it's the ultimate there. Now, once that had occurred, by 1900, as here, you can see, in terms of the other things that are built up and late in the century, that this wall is the major thing they cared about. And then with Vanderbilt and the others around here, they're concerned with closing it, but not so much. Then they never quite do it again. They have Berkeley Oval, but doesn't really turn into a quadrangle, or the Divinity School by Richard Morris Hunt here, which doesn't become quite a quadrangle either, but you do have this beginning development of the sciences especially, that are beginning to work on this joint right here, where the cemetery is, and which begin to make you feel that right here is a place that wasn't important before, but it's going to be important now with these things going up. So instantly, starting at the bicentennial, with those architects of the beginning of the century who were closely involved with the City Beautiful movement, and therefore had a sense of the city, and a sense of planning always in every building that they built. When they built here, Wolsey Hall, with behind it Woodbridge Hall, and eventually later the War Memorial, they built it right at the intersection, which is right there. It's at that difficult joint. And the building itself expresses that perfectly. You can see it here. It expresses the rotunda. It brings you out in that diagonal. You've got to get past the edge of the cemetery over there. That is the most tender and difficult, like a knee joint in Yale. It's fragile. And they understood it perfectly with Wolsey on one side and Commons on the other, and Woodbridge Hall directly behind it. The other thing that they had too was something that for a while, up until almost the present, gave them a new kind of contact with New Haven, and that is with Yale Bowl. And when we look at television and we make fun of Ohio State and all those people with all their overemphasis and so on, you have to remember that we started it. We absolutely, there's no question about it. Walter Camp, all the rest of it, we're the ones that started with the raccoon coats and the All-America and so on. It's Yale. But for a while, it really took, and sport, of course, in this way, spectator sports, the big early 20th century thing. In the 19th century, there are other issues that divided Yale and New Haven. But as you came into the 20th, and I was born in 1920, everybody in New Haven followed Yale football, especially Albie Booth from New Haven, 48, a hero, 145 pounds, my God. And everybody would go in trolleys, on trolleys out Chapel Street, the wonderful trolleys, the great thing in town, and kids would run alongside, and people would walk out or go on the trolleys, and they'd go here. It's very truncated in the map, you know, it's much farther out, but that was for a while. Gave a curious kind of fellowship between Yale and New Haven. In the sense, of course, that's eased off, gone away, and people are watching other things on TV, I suppose, at the present time. But one thinks of the athletic program at the present time, that sense of a relationship to New Haven, whatever the importance of athletics, nevertheless, for a while it was a very important one. On the other hand, in the same period, up to the 1920s, something that was really farthest from any sense of connection with New Haven began to be built. And that is, for the first time, the idea implicit in the old campus now was realized completely, and with a richness of detail and a conviction of structure that I think is unequaled in any university building anywhere else, as far as I can see, in the United States. And this is Harkness Quadrangle by James Gamble Rogers. And it is the English monastery for the life. And it is a fortification, even more than the old campus was, completely enclosed. It has moats, for heaven's sake, to protect it, as it were, from the outside. It fills up a big block. It denies it, psychologically at least, now completely, to the townspeople. And it begins to set up that sense of Yale as what it was in those days. The secret garden, dominated by senior societies, whose imagery is all through this building and in Trumbull and the others across the way, done with a wonderful sense of association, with towers in England and travel on the continent, and a very special kind of garden. Indeed, what the Greeks called a paradisos, a walled garden, a secret garden. And this was the great, beautiful, snobbish, closed Yale. Out of it came, I suppose, James Gamble Rogers' best building, which is that great tower. Harkness Tower, finished in 1920 and heavily published, was, I think, one of the models for Elio Saarinen, for his famous Tribune entry of 1922, and for Raymond Hood in his American Radiator Building, the first of the Art Deco skyscrapers in New York in 1922-23. Wonderful setting back, large sculpture, misty profiles breaking up as it goes into the sky. Anyway, that was Yale, say, by 1920. Now, at that same time, that period from 1900 to the First World War, New Haven itself was building some of its most important architecture. And again, that's with James Hillhouse. It is with a great private citizen, basically, of the town. Hillhouse, of course, was a treasurer of Yale and a legislature, but he wasn't a member of New Haven's ruling body, and neither was George Dudley Seymour. George Dudley Seymour was one of those great fundamental philanthropists, at least with his energy and with his time, which played such an important part in the City Beautiful movement. And the City Beautiful movement and George Dudley Seymour should be seen also as another great assault, maybe the last one, of the Protestant establishment, because it was full of uplift and ethic and Americanization. And so for those reasons, New Haven built really its most important buildings, I think. It built in 1908 with Cass Gilbert its free public library right there, and then its big courthouse right here, and then its post office over here. And I do think that the most important of those is the Free Public Library by Cass Gilbert. This is, which has, here you see, a presence right on the green. And that door, for anyone who grew up in New Haven, as I did in the 20s and 30s, that was the door. That was the door to the city on the hill. That's the place my friends and I went in and got 5 books, scuttled out, and took them home and devoured them, and came back. There it always was. And designed with dignity. That was important, this place. Now, the other thing about it, too, is that Cass Gilbert, who was soon to build the Woolworth Building, so he could do all kinds of architecture, wasn't too proud here to pick up in his building the basic shapes of the churches on the green. So it gets along with them. And it gets rid of the spire, changes the scale a little bit, but it is, in a word we picked up later, contextual. It's built to get along with what is there and to move out into a new function for the present. And as it moves out slightly with its brick and a white trim, it also then can lead to the next step, to the entirely masonry here and the big columns of the courthouse this time. And then finally, over there on Church Street, the post office, the last of all, begun in 1913 by James Gamble Rogers, the same time that he was getting ready to design Harkness, and finished just about the same time, and in a way the most fully abstract of all, biggest, clearest, almost in a way one might say the most ethically Protestant of all the buildings on the green, and making a wonderful contrast in the wonderful dialogue between generations, which makes the life of a city with the dark, activated, emotional, jagged city hall, which was so expressive of that new, heterogeneous immigrant New Haven of 1960. A beautiful thing. And the other thing, too, is it goes so well. The big columns, the big scale of Corinthian columns goes so well with his other building over here. In contrast, the city was standing up pretty well to the old Protestant establishment and to Yale over here. And the other thing it had, too, also George Dudley Seymour, who involved the younger Olmsted and Cass Gilbert, it had a new plan. And Cass Gilbert built the railroad station. And they planned to send a great boulevard, a leafy parked boulevard, from a hemicycle at the railroad station to a new place right there at Temple Street. Just go right in there. Now, this, of course, is the new image of the City Beautiful, of the classic tradition that goes back to French gardens and then to Paris in the middle of the 19th century. And then in 1900, when the AIA meets in Washington, and out of an enthusiasm for l'enfant and for Paris together, they set up the Macmillan Commission, and they fill up the part of the Potomac, and they extend the old plan, which is stopped here with the reflecting pool and the Lincoln Memorial and the access to Arlington, eventually to Jefferson on the other side. So you had the grid and the diagonal axis of that tradition. And indeed, that's the way it's used here. And it's used so perfectly, it seems to me, because there's the fixed community, the pedestrian scale. And indeed, at this time, the planners figured out the ideal size of a community, of a neighborhood. And it's just this size. It's the 5-minute walk from the periphery to the center. It's about what you've got. And this is what was picked up later here at Yale by Duane Plater Seiberg and the beginning of the new urbanism, which is based on that scale. Then here you have the New World, where with a dynamic, you go to the center of transportation, and it's still public transportation here at the railroad station. In a way, closest, perhaps, to what was done in that tradition in the early 20th century is Philadelphia. We have the grid there. Then you get the wonderful axis of Fairmount Park, which is a park, as this is supposed to be, with that wonderful image so exploited in that very exploitative movie, Rocky, that sense of triumph, of space, of access, of being there, looking at the city. And that's what they had. And this was, of course, not like the later freeways. It's really a park planted here with trees, the hemicycle there, and the square there, and all of it here in this wonderful relationship here to the old green. Now, the thing is, that proposal by George Dudley Seymour, by a private citizen, was never implemented, unhappily, by the city administration, but neither was the great plan for Yale, which was proposed in 1919 at the instigation of alumni by John Russell Pope. And you notice where this plan comes down. It comes down to the green at Temple Street, where it's right there. And if these two had been built, imagine the magnificent interrelationship between Yale and New Haven, with the splendor on both sides and the rationality like this. So hard to get to it now. Here, this, and then Yale, you see now, opens itself to the town. At the same time, he's so wonderful the way he keeps, it's the Berkeley Oval, where he keeps a sense of enclosure, but at the same time gives you the big, but the great thing he does,
of course, is pick up and heal that joint, because he takes Hillhouse Avenue and he has the temerity to bring it through down here close to Temple. And it's the only penetration that I can think of at the moment of the 9 squares ever by a sort of foreign movement. The other one you see stopped outside 9 squares. He brought it there, and it gives it that wonderful clarity and that beautiful opening there around the summit of the hill.
And it would have been absolutely beautiful. And the university didn't implement it either.
You can see it here, a drawing, breaking into the 9 squares, coming down to Temple Street with this great entrance, and then this beautiful axis
going up the hill.
We can see it again in that relationship of the closed to the open, of the smaller spaces to the larger spaces. He really keeps the smaller spaces discrete, but he lets them get out to the large space. And if it had been implemented, I think we would have had a Yale rather more challenging, rather sterner, rather larger, maybe in some ways more moving than the one that we have today. Because when Yale finally picked up the plan and compromised it and put Rogers to work on it in 1921, you see, Rogers just didn't do it. First of all, he didn't have the whatever to bring Hillhouse through. He probably couldn't do it. He probably met every kind. But then everything, you can see it in relation to that. Everything is closed off. You feel it. Everything begins to close off into itself, into those closed rectangles. And that's, of course, the way that the colleges were built, as here. And you can see them, all the closed rectangles. The one that's closest to the open rectangle and the axis is on what's left of cross campus here of Berkeley, where you do have, because of that relationship of a partly closed courtyard to a larger space. And it's rather a subtle one, and I think it works very well. In general, since that time, of course, nobody had a good, it's funny, none of us had a good word for the colleges. Whit Griswold was very hard on them. In the Harkness hoop of 1930 or so, other people, I remember Tubby Sizer at Yale, used to call it Yale's heroic step backward. Everybody made fun of the eclecticism of the architecture. The first positive word said in their defense by a modernist critic was by Paul Goldberger in his senior thesis of 1970 or 71 or so. And I'm happy to say that Goldberger has consented to pick up that theme and to write it again for a book about Yale architecture that we're hoping will come out in time for the tricentennial. But whatever the case, I think the style here, unlike volume being a dominant, is really used in a very modern way, that is simply as a stage set. They're not taken too seriously. And it's discreet. There's a colonial one in Davenport up there. But then, of course, on the other side is Branford. So the front is Gothic, why not, to get along with Branford. And as you go down the courtyard toward Pearson, it slowly changes, step by step in the wall, to more or less Georgian. And you get then finally into the Georgian court, and you get down to what Rogers was really best at. That is really small scale, wonderful, loving little village scale that he's able to incorporate so often, especially in Branford, which is an overwhelming experience of sensitivity to movement from space to space. But the small square of the scales, the small square of the so-called slave quarters, says something about Yale, that term itself, there in Pearson. Now, I think, though, that of all the very sweet places that were created at that time, the drama school is almost the divinity school, which is itself its own city on a hill by Delano and Aldrich of 1930, right at this time, is really the sweetest and gentlest of all. Unlike, of course, Jefferson's UVA, which also has a building at the end and pavilions on the sides, here it's much smaller. There's no contrast between white columns and red brick. It's all red brick. It makes it very dense, very compact. And the only white is what leaps up above the scale of the brick. which is the spire. And the other thing that makes it different than the University of Virginia is that at the University of Virginia, Jefferson stops thinking right there. There's nothing behind the rotunda. It just falls off. Here, there are beautiful courtyards created. And those are exactly the buildings that Yale, for reasons that are completely opaque to me, seems determined to tear down, to mutilate this building. Now, the thinking behind it sort of goes like this. It was a great school. Once it was bigger than it is now. If we're not going to move it out of there, then we should cut down its buildings to what it is now. In other words, as we dwindle, and it's only for a while, do we then mutilate our architecture? We make our whole environment more meager around us all the time. That's one thought. Another place, of course, where there is now a very considerable restoration is one of these great dining halls, this one in Berkeley. And I don't want to criticize it specifically, but I would like to suggest this. Buildings demand something from us. We're supposed to be in a place that cares about things as well as animal appetite and efficiency. This is really supposed to be the place where very beautiful things are preserved. We owe it to those buildings to live in them with dignity. And if once the ideal there was dignified dining, and now the objective has to be efficient food service, it still is better, I think, even for the digestion, not to distort the intention anymore at all. And if you can fit in what you want, make it work for you, for your whim of how you want to live in this generation, fine. If you can't, leave it alone and live with it, live with its beauty. And I think that that should be taken to heart at Berkeley. Now, on the other hand, one doesn't want to give the impression that Rogers and those people could do no wrong. Clearly, Rogers fell down sometimes. I think the massing of the stacks in Sterling is squat. And you can feel that if you look at what it would have been if Bertrand Goodhue was here. And we used to say that was bad in our modernist phase because it didn't express the light frame structure which is actually behind it. It looks heavy. That isn't what bothers me now. What bothers me now is the proportion and the thickness and the dullness as against the thrust of what Goodhue would have done. It's not much different. It's only that it's 2 stories higher. And Rogers, as you know, consciously said to them, we can have 2 more stories, or you can embellish the lower stories more richly, and they chose the second, to embellish the lower. So I think it's a little short, it's a little dumpy. It's not quite as grand, not quite as demanding as you'd like to see dominating a campus. And of course, the same is true of Pope. This is a great building, powerful building of the gym, more than a Syrian massing over there. Much more powerful, I think. That's not in Rogers' line. Rogers is gentler. And indeed, Harkness Tower is a kind of miracle in his work. This massing, of course, is not really Gothic. It's sort of Art Deco, sort of Mayan. That massiveness is typical of the 20s and early 30s, and which was typical of the work of a great many of the architects in New Haven and elsewhere who worked very well in what one might be called the traditional vernacular of architecture. I think that especially of Doug Orr here, who's great. A telephone company building there. There's this grand myoid massing, like this great, rocky, powerful building. And I stress that because I think when Yale started to build again after the war, I think that with depression and with war and with those years directly after the war, that there's a deep loss in the American conception of the city and the American conception of architecture. Modernism, in part, at that time, demanded the meagerest functionalism, as it were, or said, and wouldn't let architects do anything. So the buildings that architects, say, like Mr. Orr and others did, tended to get blank, tended to get thin, tended to get not like the earlier work, not at the same scale. And I think that generally happened. Now, Whit Griswold was
very aware of modernism's limitations. And he very much wanted, though, to exploit one side of modernism, which was coming to the fore by that time, which was the hero architect. The architect who's beyond all other boundaries, who doesn't really think about the city, doesn't really think about anything except creation. And he was lucky that the best of them all, the most preoccupied with that, was right there, ready to hand. And had joined the Yale faculty in 1947. Here's Louis Kahn, who really saw himself as building buildings up out of himself. And of course, that is the Jehovah of the Kabbalah, who creates out of nothing. There is nothing but Jehovah. So anything that's made is made up out of the self. And what's the first thing he makes? He makes light. And for Kahn, the supernal lights of the tree of the Sephirot were something that obsessed him. And the very first thing he talked about when he talked about architecture was light, which in a way which is curiously Christian rather than Judaic, which is also Kabbalistic, which mixes everything up. He associated it with silence. In the Kabbalah, you're praying all the time. You're always talking. Silence, as in San Marco in Florence, Fra Angelico, so Kahn. Silence and light. And indeed, the tree of the Sephirot is the model for his Mikveh Israel synagogue. One of the great losses of the 20th century. This great building was never built. But when he was on leave from Yale at the American Academy in Rome, he traveled to Egypt in 1951. He saw the pyramids, and he knew and he saw that they're a matter of light. That once they served the sun god Re, like the tips of obelisks, and they were sheathed in blinding white limestone. And when the sun rose, they blazed across the landscape. And how when you look at a pyramid, it really only suggests one other side, therefore a tetrahedron, rather than a full pyramidal shape. And he did his beautiful pastel of them up here, and it's all light. They're reflected from the desert, they're in shadow, and they're blazing there with light. And he began to write a little poem about them. He called them the sanctuary of art, of silence and light. Why the sanctuary of art? Because while he was there, he learned that he would have the commission for the new art gallery, and it became the sanctuary of art. Tetrahedrons carrying the light, lighting the space in this great slab, which still remains the first of Yale's modern buildings, really the greatest of all. Kahn talked about beginnings, and there you feel it. Really primitive beginnings. Not only the pyramids, of course, Buckminster Fuller, whom Louis had avoided as much as he could all his life. He was always being pushed toward him, though, by Ann Ting in his office. Fuller came to Yale. Some of you may remember that. He sat with his legs. He talked for 8 or 9 hours. Students were carried out fainting. Some of them have never recovered from that day to this. But they built a tetrahedral dome in cardboard on the top of Rear Hall, like this, and it slowly rotted. So that's connected, but I don't think Louis would ever have given way to it except for the pyramids. And of course, it was a great space. In a way, the whole sense of the open space, which is one great volume, is Miesian, like this beautiful space by Mies at Houston. But with Mies, you see, there's no structure. It's pure Neoplatonic space. The solid figure, and he always uses classical figures, naturally, solid figure in the pure space. But with Kahn, it's the pure space and the pogo panels and all open. You see the whole thing, but it's on top of you. There's that physical insistence of it coming down. And this was designed for a gallery director named Lamont Moore, and this followed his way of thinking. But then the gallery director who came didn't like it. He wanted to look like the Museum of Modern Art. He covered up the supporting piers. He destroyed the relationship to the side walls. And sadly enough, he got Paul Rudolph to do this for him when Rudolph had hardly come to New Haven. Rudolph was really blindsided, and he did it. And Kahn never spoke to him again, to my knowledge. It's a real tragedy, because no one would have less wanted to give offense to another architect than Rudolph. And of course, it's all movable, and a lot of it's being taken away now, and it's coming back. Kahn himself said that it was his own fault. It's really a Messian envelope in which he had these tetrahedrons, so you have these enormous spans. He said they could do anything they wanted with you. Also, he was upset that it was only from there on the court that you got a sense what the building really was, with the service core in the middle and then the wonderful spans on both sides. On the side toward the street, he worried because he couldn't think of anything to do but give it a brick facade. And no walls, no doors, no windows. Now that was probably wise, because if you look at an earlier project by Philip Goodwin for that same building, you see that modernism had forgotten how to design windows, how to do walls with windows in it, how to do monumental entrances. Glass and this at the same plane, Louis would have gone mad with that. So Louis said, I won't do it because I can't do it. I won't do it. I'll just change plane, because that's wonderful, where you slide in like this. And then the other thing he did, and he agonized over that, were the string courses. And there, Jehovah is getting some help from the Medici, because there's no sense that that wonderful quality of the string course in the Italian palazzo really defines a street, and helped pick up the wonderful arches of Swarthout's building in 1928 and give them a new velocity toward what eventually there became Rudolph's building, the art and architecture building across the street, which really, though it's 10 years later, I think I should mention now. Now, Kahn's building, as you can see, is cut off like that, and that's what this edge is like, just a cut-off block. And Rudolph embraces it, lifts above it, spans across it, and across the street it completes it. It's really beautiful, and Kahn must have realized that, must have seen that. The touching thing is, of course, that the Rudolph building is the last of a wonderful dialogue between the generations. It starts here with old Artie Street Hall back in the 60s, and then Swarthout does this wonderful building here in 1928, and that building was supposed to go all the way, sorry. No, I don't, nobody look at that. Supposed to go all the way to the corner, and you know, you could make an argument that it would have been better. That great building had a great plan and so on, if that went all the way to the corner. In a way, it's a better building than the Kahn building. It's a lot less maintenance. They're working on all those now, all those steel up there. But it wasn't, and what I think is good, that it didn't go all the way to the building, to the corner, is that what this gets is another voice. It's more articulate. There's another voice in there of another generation. And where the arches go like this, you slide through here, and the long string courses take you to Rudolph's building, and he sets his great pier right on the axis of the sidewalk. And he completes it. And he knows exactly what he's doing. He has this wonderful drawing, because see here, that's the edge of the 9 squares. And Chapel is starting to diverge. So he has his building do that. And this marks all the way to the green, to Bingham, the same height as Bingham. And then it begins to diverge. It shows the moving to the suburb. Sorry, I keep doing that. I don't know why. It must be some sort of fate. He picks it up as well. Now, he also had Frank Lloyd Wright in mind. As the hero architects, as Hemingway used to say, I take on Mr. Flaubert, I take on Mr. Turgenev, next week I take on Mr. Tolstoy. Rudolph was always taking on Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier. From Wright, he got the basic idea he wanted to come into a low, dark place and go to a high place going all the way up, like the Larkin building, which he couldn't see in the flesh because it was torn down. But Union Temple has the same sort of Jungian archetypal death and resurrection movement. And he did wonderful drawings showing how he liked that to aspire. And when, unlike Wright, in 1904, the fire code prevented him from taking the piers all up, maybe he should have rethought it. But he didn't. He was also involved with Corbusier.
A friend of mine in the history of art department at that time, watching Rudolph go down the street one day, leaning forward like this, said, every ton of concrete that's poured in a Corbusier building is poured right on his soul. And you could see that. And here's La Tourette. And Le Corbusier in rough concrete wants to lift these upper parts like a beam. And it can be made to look like a beam without doing violence to the function because they're Monk cells. Each one's like that. Rudolph wants the same thing. If you're going to have a great lift, it's got to lift something solid. But here, up in that beam, he was compressing painters, kicking and screaming and protesting, all up there in that tiny space. It has to be said in his defense that he designed this for Albertian painters who were doing little paintings like this. But Jack Twerkoff moved in with what Albers called Schmierkunst, and they were doing big paintings, and there was no room up there. Now, of course, they're all moving out, and it never really worked. And in a curious way, it's the end of the hero architect. It has all the elements. It's wonderful the way it lifts, though. And when you look at it, the wonderful hubris at the beginning, that orange carpet, all the love that he had here, and then how the space moves up through it, right up through here, really creating a kind of lantern. And a lantern at night, which has been obscured by the mullions since, I think, a little. A lantern which again completed that across York Street, and which went then to the great space for the architects up there, where they once had Athena, or wherever she is, standing there in glory. And then, of course, there's a fire, which unthinking commentators throughout the world ascribe to Yale students, which is not the fact. No evidence ever of arson of any kind there. More than that, Rudolph dies last year of a condition brought on by asbestos, which this building is loaded with everywhere. So he really is a heroic, tragic story in which he gives everything he's got. And when the building was opened, Nicholas Pevsner, who was the leading art historian in the world, said it wasn't a very good building at the opening, at the dedication. Oh, Rudolph said at that time, at that moment, I really didn't feel I could stay any longer at Yale. But it's a funny business. You see, this whole great series of buildings under Whitney Griswold, who had hated the old colleges and was a modernist. The fire that he had was a modernist fire. Nevertheless, there's no overall plan. It's all spotted. And if you get a lucky dialogue like that, that's wonderful. And you've got varying kinds of things happening. For example, you got a building there, the rink. I remember when that was proposed, the treasurer of Yale College went around showing a picture of a rink that had just been built at Cornell, which held twice as many people and cost half as much. But Whitney Griswold didn't want that. He wanted this great building. He got the history of art department to write a letter for him. Most embarrassing letter when I think of it. We said things like, our Orientalist senses the symbiotic relationship to nature that's characteristic of Oriental architecture. Our medievalist feels the tensile structure, and so on. It was completely tragic, I think. But here's a building, the building, you say, well, in the way, it really shouldn't be on a street. I mean, he isn't really thinking about that. But it's wonderful inside. It's wonderful for hockey. And here's another one. And then maybe that's another characteristic at this time, in part, of some of the hero architects, the preoccupation with the inside. Someone would almost say, even in towns, they'd say, who worries about the outside? You don't have any worry about that. That's up to me. It doesn't matter what the outside is. Who can demand a certain quality in relation to the rest of the town? We've come a long way since then. But here's another one. Inside, they knock your spats off. Outside, a little disorienting, I think. And I think that's the Meineke. This is the first building at Yale whose construction I ever opposed, to no effect, obviously, ever any kind. But a student of mine made this after De Chirico, and right at this time, Norman Mailer was saying, 1963, Norman Mailer wrote, modern architecture is creating the empty landscapes of psychosis. And he was right. And it happens here The reason is there's no scale is there's no scale of use, like doors and windows tell you how big it is. There's no structural scale like columns, because the Vernacular truss doesn't feel like a structure, so you don't know how big it is. It seems little. And in 1969, Oldenburg made the great suggestion to have a big cigarette butt. Leaning on that, and then you see, there's the cigarette butt, there's the table radio. Even Oldenburg's poor lipstick, which we put up there in 1969, was abashed in the space and had this sort of tragic demeanor most of the time. Then when it was moved, and of course the administration was terrified of it, they just didn't know what to do with it, and they let it rot there. And then it came to life in Morse, where you had a denser environment, and it was all built in permanent materials. And it's wonderful when we set it up, and a wonderful international orange really makes the sky turn blue. And I said that to Oldenburg, and he said, yes, it turns on the sky. And it really does. And you know, it's a wonderful thing. People keep wanting to get this in the gallery, so nobody can scratch it or anything. And here's one of the few works of art in modern times which exists as the center of a culture. Like the ancient divinities, it's loved and derided, and it's the symbol of its college. It functions in a community. To close that up in a gallery would be an obscenity it would be the whole step backward as to what this is all about. And we hope it never happens. We hope it stays in Morse. Now, on the other hand, for example, the other thing that began to be apparent in the 60s is sometimes you really got the feeling that the old buildings were a lot better than the buildings that were going to replace them. I had that feeling very strongly back then. I also opposed this, got nowhere. I had the help of Steve Weissman and all that wonderful first generation of smart people who were brought here by Kingman. In the 1960s, Weissman started the New Journal. Now it's in the New York Times. He and Maureen Dowd are the two knife men of the editorial page, but it was no use. And when in the summer, North Chef and Winchester were torn down, and that's always in the summer that the university tears things down when nobody's around. I think the dean of Yale College sadistically sent me a photograph of the Wrecker's Ball, just about to hit it. Now, here's another building earlier, which is a rather dreary modern building of that period, Gibbs by Schweiker. But Gibbs has, I think, one great quality. At that time, Sarin had a suggestion that the university have a slab, long slab, going across the summit of the hill like this, with its long face down Hillhouse Avenue. Well, you see, that would have been pretty bad. It would have killed the summit. So, despite pressure, Schweiker put this to the side, leaving the summit open, which meant, you see, that then when you looked up Hillhouse Avenue, here, where originally the Hillhouse mansion could focus the view because it was below the summit, and a compact building itself, instead of a thing that crossed there, then, coming along a few years later, Johnson could put his tower in the right place, not in the middle, but to the side, so you went up to the open summit there. And he made a place, a wonderful, I think, great windy place up there, which has now been completed, not too well, I think, on the north side, by the sort of shredded wall of the Bass laboratory, which is there. Of all the towers, though, I think, built at Yale, I think the most touching are those of Stiles and Morse, because there Saarinen tried very hard to make it fit in with what was there before, especially with John Russell Pope's great gym. And he went out on the site and he flew balloons beforehand, tried to get the idea of the height, and he set up a wonderful walkway between the two colleges that led to the gym itself. In a very modernist way, he just wouldn't do a straight masonry wall of any kind. It had to be kind of cast concrete. The stone in it came out looking a little bit like adobe. But nevertheless, the whole idea is one of the most touching and in a sense the most tragic that's happened at Yale. Because one thing he wanted to do, a little bit like Pope, was to have the axis and also the courtyards, make them work together. He also wanted the townsfolk to be able to walk through from York Street to the gym. And he therefore specified that there would be no gates anywhere here. By the time he died, before the buildings were completed, his widow, Aline Saarinen, fought with the university to eliminate gates. Finally, they compromised, saying there would be gates, but they would never be closed. They would never be locked. And by the time I was master there, not much longer, in 1969, they had to be locked all the time. And they've had to be locked ever since. And this is a tragic statement of the relationship between Yale and New Haven over that period of time. We had other tragedies of a different kind. One was the loss of this great addition to the mathematics building by Robert Venturi in 1970, again on Hill House Avenue, where Venturi takes as a base DUH, and basically it's fenestration, and then turns it, just steps across the canal, railroad line, turns it like an opening gate facing up the hill toward the sciences. Most of the humanities behind him, a gate between the two sides of Yale. A little farther up Hill House Avenue, at the present time, Venturi was taken off a project because the donor, and the Venturi building was never built only because its donor died. And his family didn't honor the bequest, and building costs exploded, and though the university wanted to build it, it never could be built. Venturi was taken off this, and the architect who took it over managed to destroy 2 streets at once in its placement. Hill House Avenue, by setting it back like that, by cutting a hole in it, it crouches in there like a frightened animal, and Prospect Street on the other side, by the ambiguity of its relationship to it. No relation to anything to the street. It's a tragic thing. However, talking about that, it doesn't deal at all with the most important developments, I think, of the period since that time, and that is what's happened to New Haven. As remember I said before, starting with Eli Whitney, New Haven developed the most wonderful bunch of factories all over the town. Surprising when you look at the old maps, you see how they're right up close to Whitney Avenue and everything else. However, it began to fill up also later with slums. And starting in the 1930s, some very bad housing was built. A lot of it has been torn down since, right behind the gym. So here's Yale with all its splendor, and then behind it, over here, low rise, and over here was high rise, all of which has been torn down, and a lot less was torn down. And New Haven, especially after, oh gosh. Can you pick this up? I'm sorry, I can't bend over. Thanks, just pick it up for me. There it is, that box. See that box? Yeah, thanks, thank you. Thank you. If I were to bend over there, this hip would pop right out in your faces, actually. You wouldn't want that. So, in any event, and then, as you know, after World War II, when people were recruited from the South to come up and work in the war plants, many of them, with perfect cynicism after the war, moved back down south for cheaper labor. And it's been plotted, the downward mobility of a great deal of the New Haven population because of the loss of jobs. The other thing that hit them tragically was the rather misdirected zeal of architects and planners at the very worst moment in architectural and planning history in the time of redevelopment in the 1960s, when the mad schemes of Maurice Rodival were going to cut Yale off by the inner circumferential ring road right behind the gym I showed you a moment before, by roads that were by no means parks like those of the City Beautiful, but deserts which divided the two sides from each other. And indeed, all this dividing the 9 squares from the railroad station, very symbolic, destroying the neighborhood, and it was a viable neighborhood, whatever was said about it at the time. And others, as people from these neighborhoods were moved into others, and indeed you can follow I-95 all the way from Maine to Miami, where it subsides back into US 1, you can see it destroying center city neighborhoods, mostly African-American neighborhoods, one by one, until finally it climaxes it with a wonderful old neighborhood called Overtown, where Cab Calloway used to delight to perform, which was blasted out of existence by I-95 in its last few blocks. And that began to happen. That began to happen here. And indeed, it was such a different world of how to move the car. Here, the car is going to be moved, and it's still moved very well around Chicago and other places by Burnham's boulevards, on a boulevard which is also a park, and which went in 2 directions, and which was connected with a neighborhood, with the texture of a town. And then the plans that redevelopment offered were abstract plans of towers and slabs, breaking up the street grid, breaking it up and paying no attention to the vernacular, the wonderful New Haven 2- and 3-family vernacular, which makes a wonderful density, and which right at this time at Yale, in the early 70s, as a reaction against redevelopment, Andreas Rainey and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg were learning, and out of that, the new urbanism, which I happen to believe in, out of that, the new urbanism came. Same thing was true when redevelopment hit the green. There it was preservation. Today, the enormous strength of the National Trust for Historic Preservation really begins right here in the 60s, when we began to learn that you had to fight for everything, because it was all a question of the relationship of everything else, making a neighborhood, making a green, making a city. And here, to the names of James Hillhouse and George Dudley Seymour, has to be added the name of Margaret Flint. Peggy Flint, the wife of Dick Flint, who, not an architect, not a planner, rallied us all. She was director of the New Haven Preservation Trust, rallied us all, finally got the congressmen and the judges to get behind us, and managed to save some of it. Saved the post office, weren't able to save enough of City Hall, didn't win all the way. There's a great big building back there now, but we don't get this empty landscape of psychosis, which we would have had right here. We don't lose the library, though it's been insensitively added to. That was going to lose its presence on the green, and its functions were going to be put back in here somewhere, because there were no functions for this stylish international style, just like that housing I showed you, the tower and the slabs. Doesn't matter what it's for. Just the opposite of designing by type here. So we all learned something. We learned, for example, that everything had to relate to everything else. Cass Gilbert could do it, we could do it. And indeed, Robert Venturi learned that lesson, though he'd already been doing it himself in Philadelphia. And he built his beautifully contextual buildings, where he makes each place a little better on its own terms. The idea is not to knock your eye out, the thing never seen before on God's earth, but to heal whatever wounds have been dealt to places by inflecting a building which is clearly a modern building to what was there before. Unhappily for us, at Princeton, his alma mater, rather than at Yale. While he was doing that, his great rival and teacher and friend and enemy, Lou Kahn, was building these great buildings on the subcontinent of India. And the buildings where that sense of beginning was very strong, where normally there was no glass. It was like a great ruin. Indeed, it was based on the great Roman ruins of brick and concrete, like this great little thermopolium, this hot drink stand in Ostia, where Brown was led by the great Frank Brown of Yale, the archaeologist of the American Academy in Rome, who turned a whole generation's eyes to how the splendor of the Roman ruin. And Kahn built there a dacha. He built right out of it, right out of the throne. And as with the ruins, with no glass. And indeed, he was picking up what the very first prophets of modern architecture had loved. Piranesi, in the middle of the 18th century, the ruins of Rome, out of which the sublime of the modern violent age could be created, as in his great carcery here of the middle of the 18th century, and Kahn built them as well in the great meeting hall at Dacha. You look up the stairs through the holes, and you're again in the great stairs of the carcery going up into space. And when Kahn began to do his latest work at home, the same thing. Glass was subordinated. The Kimball is a Roman round-headed arch, distorted by design, as Kahn would say. The light, it also reflects the ruin. And at Exeter, on the outside, where he has to use glass, he keeps it back, he subordinates it, and he takes it out up above, and indeed won't let the building join the corner. He wants it to look like a ruin. Wants to keep that quality. And that's what makes it so remarkable. When he finally does the great Mellon Center, the glass is the great thing. The glass comes out incandescent, at the same plane as the matte surfaces of the stainless steel, and reflects and explodes with light. And the original designs for it, what was cut down in scale, were on this order of the brick and the concrete with great arches. They're on the Roman ruin order. But this picks up something totally different, something which really started a century later in the development of modern architecture, the development of the type out of which all the skyscrapers came. And that is the great Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève by Labrouste, where you see you get that system where you're going to rationalize the ruin into metal construction inside, here into concrete, where you have the support, the closing panel, and the glass set within the frame. And that becomes a type, a slab. And then you have the great string course. It sets the street scale. And indeed, this great girder is setting the scale, letting you enter under it, which again, he's still not designing an entrance. He just eats you up. As you go in there, you have shops. That is the one physical result I know of the student activism of the 1970 and 71. They demanded shops here, and Louis, realizing what he could do with it, eventually incorporated them. The other thing, in terms of the type, when you stop to think about it, it picks up, coming from high style, picks up the idea of type. Here are the brick wall and the frame inside, but nevertheless the type here of the old brick row. The old brick row, which of course defined the great space with that type, and could do it because it was the repetition of a type. And Kahn here defines Chapel Street. And it's so beautiful that when you look at it, at the angle of reflection, so Descartes telling us, being the angle of sight, he affects everything. Swarthout's great building, his own building, and Rudolph itself across the street. You have a contextual relationship where he shapes a space. And if he'd lived, one doesn't know, perhaps he would have moved farther in this direction. Whatever the case, certainly the university has. And now, unlike those great days of Whit Griswold, when it was the hero architect, mano a mano, with all the others, now it's the idea of the plan as a whole and its relationship to New Haven. So Cooper and Robertson, two Yaleys here, confer as much, they claim, and I hope it's true, with Mayor DeStefano as they do with President Levin, as they're related. And they do something else which is really wonderful. It's the power of drawing. For the first time, they turn around Ezekiel's plan, and they draw Yale, not the way Yale, following New Haven's, it had always been drawn. They draw north-south, south-north. Now, vertical bodies, we tend to associate with our own. We tend to experience them empathetically, in our own body. So when you look at it this way, well, you know it's intruding. But when you look at it here, you're getting it in the kidney, right there. You feel it cut the university, right at that point, you feel how rickety a structure. They shouldn't be tearing things down, but a rickety structure they have as it goes up at that terrible joint. And when you see Harvard, I'm sorry it isn't the same scale as this, look at Harvard. It inspires fear. One great blob. And it engulfs the Charles. Look at that thing. Off in the center. And here's poor old Yale. I hope Harvard never finds out. It also makes you see, when you turn it around, how wonderful the Pope plan was. There's a master. You really look at that, and you could weep, I think, the fact that it was never implemented, the power of that coming down. Feel it. It solves everything. And indeed, it makes you feel, too, as it goes, how much Yale is moving up in that direction to the north. And how wonderful spaces, and they are beautiful spaces, that are going to be torn down, I hope not, in the Divinity School, could be used for something else. That's the great thing about great buildings, they don't have to be used for their original functions. People use them for all kinds of things over the ages because they love them so. That could happen there. But when you see this, you think of New Haven, for example, as the university says, as instantly this plan showed, and experience shows it, so many people are coming in here at Trumbull Street, up there, coming in now from the freeway, rather than here at the Green, from the railroad station. And one would hope, in that point of view, if one wants to make a gate over there, it would be awfully nice to incorporate the pre-existing buildings on the site, which distinguish us from a cow college instituted yesterday. It's the dimension of time which is lost if you instantly react with terror over a new building, unless somebody sue you about it and try to tear it down, which Yale has done often with demolition by neglect from the very beginning of its history. I think it's time to stop. The other thing is, in relation to New Haven, the wonderful possibility of getting away from all those single one-way streets, which create non-urban situations. You see it there. And it makes you then think in terms of the street. You think how intrinsic the whole pattern of those streets right here, New Haven, and to Yale, which someday has got to get through there in some way. What a bad idea, which the university had a while ago, to close those. Right there. It's one of the few places I know where cars and human beings coexisted without problems. And a street is so wonderful with its curve and its structure. It has a wonderful urban quality, and this is an urban university, deeply involved. Its future is involved with the future of the town. It's easy for us, of course, to identify our obsession and our need for secrecy. And it's easy for us, too, out of our commitment to teaching and learning, to make connections with other universities all over the world. But it's harder for us to make physical contact with the more heterogeneous community, which is that of our city. Once, of course, we did it better than we do it now. But we also know that it was easier then. Now the problem is like that of the country as a whole, to reshape a heterogeneous, multiracial community of us all. But here we are, university and the city, whose hope of immortality gave birth to all universities. This one especially, out of a burning Puritan idea, this haven of exiles, this heaven on earth for all mankind to see. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else? Thank you. Stop. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I really can't thank you enough. There is no more loving community in the world than that of Yale College faculty, Yale University faculty and students together. I've never known anything like it, nothing like it at Harvard, nothing like it anywhere else. I thank you all. It exists and we can live it.